Thanks, Ellen.
So, welcome. Thank you so much for coming in this festive season where everything is so Christmassy and busy. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We're at Varvara Roza Galleries, and we have the exhibition of Tom de Freston pieces that I curated. So my name is Vasiliki, I'm the curator, Vasiliki Giannakou, Tom de Freston, the artist, and Kieran Millwood Hargrave.
It's a long one.
Yes, I'm sorry. Is the artist as well, in a way.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yes, which I think it's like kind of collaborative project. So I would like to start from a welcome. Thank you. Tom, congratulations. And the story behind that, as we all know, is a sad one. Undoubtedly, is a story of loss, of grief, 6 repetitive miscarriages, 1 twins. I don't know if it counts as 7. But yeah, an emotional roller coaster non-stop. So how this emotional roller coaster ended up being an artwork, and how this loss was interpreted into beauty. So, Tom, I will start from you. You take the mic.
Thank you
So
very much.
yours.
Shall I just hold this or clip it?
Whatever you like.
I'll clip it onto the cats. There we go. Well, I suppose it actually began with the first pregnancy, didn't it? So in that period that we all want to erase of like the first lockdown, and Kieran was pregnant with twins. And I think we'd spent quite a few years, kick me if I say anything I'm not meant to be saying.
I will.
Yeah. We spent quite a few years unsure if we even wanted to be parents. And then once we decided we did, it was like there was an absolute certainty to it. So yeah, Kieran was pregnant with twins. It was quite early. She'd had this sense of something, like you were saying in an interview the other day, like you're very in tune with your body, like something not feeling quite right. So we went to the early pregnancy unit, which unfortunately we got to know really well. And it was that point where partners weren't allowed in. And so I was kind of sat in the car. And then, so from my perspective of what I then became aware of, Kieran emerged, came out, and like I sensed something was like off. So at that point I thought it was bad news, which kind of got in the car. I was like, it's twins, so we didn't know at this point. And we had this like, we both described this like kind of your future kind of completely unfolds instantly. And I think the fact it was twins meant that process was heightened, because you're suddenly like, oh, this is just going to be batshit. Yeah.
Like intense, super intense. How are you going to breastfeed two? I mean, it's the first thought, how can you handle and manage?
Exactly that. Yeah. And like, so I think even in the car ride home, we were like, okay, this is what the future, the bits of it we might know how it looks.
And I was like, my mum's moving in, this is going to be great.
That was exactly what you said. Yeah. And then from that first moment, I knew I was going to paint and write about the whole experience. And at that point, I thought it was going to be just for something kind of for us, like kind of for private consumption. So I started to make these paintings in the studio. And the idea was I was going to make one painting for every single day that the twins were in gestation through to the moment they were born. They were all going to be the same size. They were going to be stacked up. So the idea that they'd become somewhere between a book and a stack of paintings, so that they'd be speaking to, like, Kieran's a novelist, as I'm sure you all know, but like, so they're somewhere between our two forms and our two registers. And then that they were 2 circles to start with almost a sense of absence because of that early stage of growth. And then the idea is they'd evolve day by day, never with a view to like they weren't going to be ending up looking like babies in any form, but just somehow they'd be speaking to that growth. And it was like, well, these would be like prayers and spells and like things towards this. And then we went for this private scan, expecting it just to be this moment that meant we could both see them, but both hear the heartbeats. And that was when you have that awful moment of like the mood of a room shift, and you become really like aware of these shifts when they weren't able to hear heartbeats, and you were kind of aware there was this loss. So that like unfolding that I described, like then instantly it was like this like collapsing down. Yeah. Right. And you're kind of, that whole future just goes like this and goes. And then I think in the coming weeks,
So you had already produced some paintings?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so there'd already been like a stack that was kind of in relation to the number of days. And then I kind of knew I was going to have to carry on painting through this and writing through this without having any idea what that meant or what that looked like. But this would just be like the idea of the studio as like a sanctuary that would allow me to be processing stuff, because then I knew, like, okay, well, we're partners in this, but something's happening to Kieran's body that I'm intimately connected to, but cannot have any comprehension of the kind of physical form of the loss. So it was then like, studio space to resolve all of this. That was kind of its start point.
And when did your studio burn?
When
Because at
Yes.
some point everything became a charcoal.
Yeah.
In seconds, your whole artistic life,
I
all the artworks you had in the studio, kind of. So when exactly was that? Before, after, during? When did this happen?
I was trying to work this out. It was
It
just
was
before.
It was just before lockdown. So I was in Las Vegas with my friend, having the best time ever, and I had a text from a friend saying, "Is your house on fire?" And so I texted Tom and I said, "Is our house on fire?" And he said, "No, everything's fine."
Our
He sent me a
house
picture of our cat, Luna, and our house wasn't on fire, but his studio was. So I came back in early March, late February, which obviously was just before lockdown, and found that Tom's studio had burnt down, which I kind of want to just say also trigger warning, and I apologize if any of this material is sensitive, and please do feel free to kind of take a breath or whatever. But the fire, it's interesting you think it started with the losses, this body of work, because my instinct was the Orpheus and Eurydice collaboration, which in fact was 10 years ago.
What do you want to tell everyone about that?
So Tom and I have been together and romantically, but also collaborating for 16 years.
What started first?
The romance. I mean, romance.
Or the collaboration.
The heartbreak,
Okay.
and then the romance.
Well, I painted you before I spoke to you.
Yeah, Tom's painted me before he spoke to me. Charming. So we met during a play where he painted me for this play, and then sort of we became involved, and then we fell in love, and then very foolhardily I offered to write some poetry when my director of studies asked if anyone wanted to put forward anything for this exhibition she was doing for the Shakespeare Association. I said, I'll write some poems in response to Shakespeare, and my partner can do some paintings. And she said yes, and I'd never written poetry before, but I was you're confident when you're 20. So that was our first collaboration, and since then we realized that we worked well together, and we went on to do this this project that ended up being a book for Bloomsbury, but started life just as a spoken word and art installation with our friend and collaborator Max Barton, who was a musician director, and it became sort of this show that inhabited the story of Orpheus and Eurydice through art, spoken word, and music. So that was, and the reason I think these kind of feel like the origin of this to me is, first of all, some of the lines from the poems that I wrote 10 years ago are actually embedded into the paintings. And then the other reason is there's like this uncanny echo, because my Eurydice, I wanted to give her agency. And so I decided that instead of treading on a snake and dying, she would have committed suicide due to a lost pregnancy. So there's sort of this uncanny echo there. And I think something that is strange but ultimately positive for me is that how accurate the emotions I expressed in those poems were to what I then later experienced. And actually, I didn't have the words when I was going through it, but a past me had already, expressed some of the things I was going through. So that's quite special. Yeah. But it's just always interesting, isn't it? Like, where do you think these things start? Yeah.
And the fire?
The fire, yeah. So those first paintings were made in the aftermath of the fire. And I suppose everything that I've made since then, because that is 5 years ago, has in some ways incorporated the fire. Sometimes very literally. So there were paintings that were pulled, in the aftermath of the fire, were removed from there, and they'd become these kind of almost like found objects, because they'd completely transformed, but they had this kind of power that I thought, okay, these are now art objects. There were then paintings that I made directly in response to the project that the fire had. Okay, to take a step back, I'd been working on this other project, which is a collaboration with a blind Syrian writer academic, Ali, and a filmmaker called Mark Jones. And it was an attempt to translate Ali's unseen world of memory and metaphor, so his experience of blindness, of war, of displacement, onto canvases. And 2 years into that project, I was just fiddling with the final body of paintings in the studio, ready to reveal them to them the next day. And I was fiddling with a blowtorch, which, plot spoiler, don't do. And then it went up like in a minute, and so the whole studio was down. So then I made a new body of work for that project from the remnants of the fire. But those first paintings about the twins, I was literally, again, like almost like spells. Like I was mixing charcoal, and I'd also saved a bucket. When you go into space after a fire and like it, up to here and water from the fire brigade, and all of that was like thick black sludge, like ink. And I saved like buckets and buckets and buckets of that, and the ash. So then I was making the paintings, mixing all of this stuff in, almost in this kind of alchemical way, or attempt to be kind of alchemical. And then so even in these paintings, there are bits of, little bits of ash mixed in. Yeah, and like occasionally that I'd use when I'll lay down grids or bits of wood or things where I'm trying to kind of cause traces and echoes and scars to the surface. Lots of those things that I was using for that were materials, architectural bits of materials from the fire that I'd lay down and then, leave on for months and then remove. So I've still not got rid basically of most of that stuff. It's like in very weird echo, the building next door to our house is a burnt out building, and all my burnt out remains from the studio are housed in there. Yeah.
Not spooky at all.
Not spooky at all. It does feel like a horror. You go in there, you're like, am I in a horror film?
Like, that there was an again and again and again. So how this kind of, process accumulated, and you felt that it was therapeutic to continue working together, and so how this kind of collaboration and evolved through this repetition of pain and loss. Because after the twins, you had another 6.
So we had another 6, and
in a period of 4 years.
So we were making actually our first children's book together. So we'd signed up for it before, because I started as a children's writer. I now write books for adults, teenagers, and children. And I'd been trying to convince Tom to work as an illustrator with me for a long time, but our ideas kept being terrible. But we finally had this idea that really couldn't have been written at any other time, because it was sort of, from my point of view, it was about this girl being parented by a parent with mental health issues. And so it was sort of me working through whether I felt I could be a good mother, whatever that means, whilst having mental health issues. So it was my way of working that book out. And then obviously it took on this whole new resonance because we'd had the losses, and initially we know it happens all too frequently, but then it became, oh, maybe this isn't going to happen for us. And then the books became more of an exploration of a future that might not happen rather than a preparation for it. But as I'm not a great believer in artist therapy often being very good art, like I think they serve quite different functions, but it was a real pleasure to sort of work through a lot of my feelings in my art and then get to tear them apart until they were actually good. That actually was a strangely healing process, because I didn't have control over anything else, but I did have control over whether something was good or not, ultimately.
How do you decide what to share and what not? So when you write something or when you make a painting, there are the things that you hold back, and how much you make public? How much do you, is there everything you spit it out, or you hold something back, or you decide together, or each one of you have different level? I don't know, how did that work?
Well, for a long time, Tom refused to acknowledge there was autobiography in his work. And it was actually that body of work with Ali that he was discussing. I saw this, that there's the the sort of monograph is over there. That was the first time you accepted, no, these are actually paintings about me and about my life. And obviously this is explicitly autobiographical, but it actually you came to that a bit slower, whereas I've always been a very open book and refused to sort of feel shame about a lot of things that maybe traditionally people do, or maybe even should feel shame about. But I've always sort of worked through things in quite a public way, and never sort of subscribed to silence around things. Whereas you're a bit more considered, maybe.
Well, I think one, because
more
like
self-conscious,
or maybe because often my work is, well, say this body of work where, and this is maybe true of like most of my work, where in some ways they're like attempts at empathy. And like if you take like literally the root of the word empathy to mean to feel into, so like attempts to feel into someone else's experiences. And I think of the other, so as in anyone, any one of us is like having these like vast, limitless like psychological landscapes within us. And like, is it possible to inhabit the landscape of the other? And then in this case, you're making paintings to make that unseen world seen. And obviously it's an impossibility. That's the whole point. And obviously it's an impossibility for the potential father to be, or the male figure, the artist in this case, to imagine into an experience that my body cannot go through. But that's what made me feel this is even more important to try. But that obviously brings with it a different baggage of, this isn't my experience, so you have to navigate that carefully. But I'm always reminded of, I won't quote it because I'll butcher the quote, but like there's a David Foster Wallace thing where he was saying, so much art nowadays, and this is particularly true in the art world, is so full of irony and self-aware and meta and kind of clever, and it's about you getting the trick and probably being aware of a particular form of language that is within that world. So you get these kind of siphoned off forms of culture where, people who know their art history will get this nod, or if you're reading a book, like people with particular literary awareness, and everything in a kind of, if you're too really crude, postmodern era is about this like self-knowing thing. And his idea was like the most radical thing you can do is to be vulnerable and kind of openly tender. And I think I kind of attempt to take that into the work, that you like, so you should be as open as possible, as vulnerable as possible, and the work comes from there, and then still comes out in ways that are presumably layered and web-like and hard to pick apart. But you're not trying to play games with people. You're trying to like make your skin as raw as possible, and for that to be in the work. And then obviously it's different. Making a painting is different to writing a book, in that.
So are some of these figures you?
I see the footprints and the hands as both as me, as the kind of abstract idea of the artist, and as the kind of the space that the viewer can then inhabit. So I see them as kind of absences that speak of past presence, and I see them as the kind of the voyeuristic view of the viewer, and the viewer can obviously be me or someone coming to them. And therefore, hopefully what the paintings are is kind of invitations for someone to meet at this space, the same space that I kind of left. Whereas obviously the bodies are both Kieran and the figure of Eurydice. They're these kind of half real, half mythological things.
Yeah, I wanted to ask for that, because you had the whole transition as well, painting Kieran, so how did this kind of change the actual painting or the figure, or what was the impact of the myth and this kind of irony that you said at the beginning, that the myth kind of found ground and happened, and kind of in an uncanny way. So how did this change your figuration, or your painting, or the visual representation of the figure, apart from the apparent pregnancy?
In a very, very direct way, and there was a kind of a line in the sand moment where, for the first couple of years of working on, so not these paintings, but this body of work, I'd been approaching it a bit like all my previous projects. So one of the things I'll do, one of the tools I'll use, is I kind of set up stages. So I kind of create scenes, literally. So I'd say it might be my studio, it might be our bedroom, it might be the sitting room, but construct a space, and a space that might speak to a particular moment of, in this case, let's say the myth. So you're kind of constructing an architectural or theatrical version of the underworld, and then Kieran then becomes a character who's like entering the scene, and then you're working together collaboratively, a bit like a director might do, and you're filming it and photographing it. And what you're really doing is kind of hunting and scavenging for imagery. So you're trying to like find imagery in that process and ideas and be alive to it. So you might start with some very simple prompts, but you don't know where it's going to go. And I'd been doing that, and I'd built this huge archive of imagery that, you know, then might lead to drawings and collages and small studies that might lead to paintings. And it all felt artificial and constructed and knowing and untrue to what was happening to us. And it all felt loaded in metaphor and again, like clever nods. And it all felt too designed. And then it was in the pregnancy that led to our daughter being in the world, where, well, two things happened. One, like we had this moment of hope where we'd been like banging our heads against a brick wall of like kept trying, kept having losses, and kind of thinking like, we know we want a child, so we're carrying on this path, and it just feels kind of insufferably painful. And then I went. Can I say this?
Don't name
Yeah.
her.
No. So a friend actually offered to be a surrogate as a kind of like, they were like, look, if ever you needed me to, I'd be a surrogate. And I don't even think we'd have necessarily ever taken up
Definitely not.
that
She'd have
that
lost her
opportunity.
mind.
Yeah, she would have lost that offer. But it suddenly like made us realize there's these different possible paths, including a path where we don't have children, and that can be something that we embrace rather than something that we fear. And I think from that moment of kind of then shifting from grief to hope, because we're like, okay, there's good paths here. Like whatever the outcome is, this is one we'll embrace. I started recording Kieran's body in the different stages of pregnancy, and completely casually and informally as a record for us. So they would just be, you know, Kieran getting in and out of a bath, or we'd be traveling for Kieran's work, and I'd be photographing her, or you know, I'd be in bed in the morning and Kieran would be like, go, and you're just taking all these snaps. And at one point I was looking through those and I was like, they're the thing. Like, kind of, so obviously they're the thing. And not, oh, now I want to go and make some, like, I mean, kind of very obviously hyper naturalistic painting of those scenes, but like there's something in those that is speaking to the truth of all of this. So they became a source from which I could lift those figures out of one world, so the kind of the domestic, the personal space, through drawing, through monoprinting, through all these different processes, and then enter them into a kind of a mythic underworld space. And so the idea that these figures become part Kieran, part Eurydice. And it was such a gift. And it was something about then you're searching for figures in a new way. So like the way a figure might move, you know, just entering a space or just shifting their weight backwards to leave a space, took on this new weight in a way that if you were staging them would just be different, not better or worse, but just different. And it felt like there was to use the same word again, but like a tenderness that could be tapped into for that. So yeah, that became, is that fair to say? That became the kind of archive from which it emerged.
Okay, I'm going to be blunt here.
Yes, please.
I mean, you decided to take these figures, these motions, you were taking snapshots, photographs, and then why did you decide to make, you know, kind of more abstracted figures and make paper cuts and put the paper cut on a painting rather than trying to perhaps paint the actual figure that you were seeing? So what led you to this kind of artistic choice?
So there's a mixture, yeah. So actually, this one's a good example of this. So that figure, originally the central figure, say, will have been painted up. I mean, I hate it when people say this, because I say painted up quite traditionally. Like, well, that means like a million and one different things. But you know, painted up in like a fairly conventional sense of how a figure might be painted up, and how you might construct and sculpt the figure, and how you might construct flesh. And there was a certain purposeful naturalism to it that I knew was never going to be the end point. But I kind of wanted that in place first. And then at the same time, I was making these stencils of figures. So I'd, you know, sometimes I'd make a stencil of the exact same figure. And it was important in both cases that they were either life size or sometimes just over, partly so these figures are kind of sat on the surface. They're like just, you know, just hovering just in front of you or even closer. And the stencils allow for a very different thing to the painted up figure. So you've obviously got the stencils of the hands and the feet, which are kind of interruptions, but the stencils of the figures themselves, so say this figure here that was made from a stencil, mean that you can, you know, to be really literal, the painting's on the floor, you lay the stencil down, however you might be spraying, pouring, painting on top, And then obviously when you're removing it, again, you're having an absence. So it's like you're able to then create these kind of spatial confusions so that the flesh of that figure is actually, maybe not obviously, but is actually sat behind the kind of the blue and creamy grid that sat on top of it. And then it becomes this idea of figures who are dissolving, forming, unforming, vanishing, emerging in every sense. So whether that's walking off into a space or towards, or whether that's kind of the fleshy corporeal matter of the figure dissolving into something. I'm always dubious of the word abstraction anyway, for a whole other set of reasons, but dissolving into what we might think of as abstraction, or kind of a more expressive mode of thinking of how a body might exist. So it was just almost trying to open up a full range of languages for how you might consider a body, and then thinking of obviously the pregnant body as then, is this body of life being, hopefully of life being formed, of things stitching together, of finding form, and wanting that to kind of have its presence in the making of the paintings.
And then let's go back to the books, because I interrupted you there. So you started saying about how the same story, the same emotional journey, was interpreted into a book, which is a completely different form.
Yeah.
So what was the differentiation in the experience of how did they work in parallel, or what scope each one kind of fulfilled in their own way?
What's interesting is there's different books. There's the book. So I wrote a book called Strange Bodies. It's about this body of work.
The process of making it and
Yeah.
the pregnancy. Yeah.
And that's become like a central part of my practice, I suppose. And it's like the idea of like language gives you a different way into the material to paint. And before, I'd almost found my work like overburdened by the stuff that was kind of happening through language or intellectually. And like by writing a book, it's like all of that can exist in there, and then the work can be unburdened. So that book, its path is basically from the first pregnancy through to our daughter arriving in the world, and it was kind of written concurrently with it all happening. So I didn't know the shape of the story, and then it sits alongside the kind of the strand of being in the studio, seeing all the thinking towards what these paintings will become, evolve. And then the kind of the third strand, I suppose, is this kind of art, historical art, critical strand, where these paintings, each chapter kind of takes a different painting as a way to think through what does it mean to look at paintings, and how are they almost like my guide through everything, like, so through the personal, psychological stuff, but also through the creative stuff. And I think it's something to do with, I'll say this. The first gallery I was ever with, we parted ways because we had this meeting where they said, I think you reveal the magic of the studio too much. You're working on all these collaborative projects, and I think you just need to focus on just the paintings, and there's too many things going on. And like every fiber of my being thought, I think the opposite. Like I think so much in the art world is this kind of Wizard of Oz world where you pull the curtain back and you're like, oh God, there's nothing there. Like, and the whole notion of it is to like make us think there's something there. I was like, what if you have to pull the curtain back and you go, God, this is even more astonishing, or a different kind of astonishment to the work. So that excited me, combined with like the idea of the studio is like this space that the individual artist goes and it's sealed off, and this magic happens, and then the work's produced, and it's all kind of beyond us. I just liked the idea of revealing all of that, and not revealing it in such a way that it's like I know everything that happened and what I felt and thought, so now I'm just documenting that. But the book almost becomes a way to excavate it as you're writing. So writing becomes like an active thing rather than a kind of just a passive form of recording. And then that's a very different thing, I think, to like, so because these experiences have ended up in your books in various ways, haven't they? So there's a different.
So yes, how you experience seeing Tom responding like this, and what are the differences in a way between your books?
I mean, I could not write nonfiction about my experience then. I don't know if I ever will. But I wrote a fiction book where the character, it was the hardest book I've ever written so far, because the character just changed completely through the experiences that we were having, from being this sort of quite green young wife who dreams of becoming a mother to being this woman who had experienced recurrent pregnancy loss, and she's a beekeeper, and it's set during the Strasbourg dance plague in 1517. So it's about, you know, hysteria and motherhood and agency and bodies, and it just completely changed. So that book holds so much of the raw material of what I was feeling. I kind of don't have anything to add to it, you know, because I've sort of been approached to write articles or nonfiction about the experience, because the condition I have is called hyperfertility, and it's a very under-researched but actually quite common condition, and most women who have it don't know they have it. So it's, you know, I can see that a book like that would be useful, but I'm not the right person to write it, because I feel like I've processed what I went through, and kind of everything that I have is in that book, is in that novel. But in terms of seeing Tom responding to it, initially when he asked to use the private, you know, the domestic imagery, because I'm very used to being, you know, naked in Tom's work. The first time Tom met my dad, it was in front of a naked painting of myself. So I've never been, I've just, people ask like, how are you with this? I'm like, I don't, it's fine, it's normal. But, you know, these photographs were not meant for public consumption. You know, they were photographs of me getting out the bath pregnant, which, if you've ever done that, not elegant. Like, you know, they're not, but I trust, there's a huge amount of trust in our relationship. I trust Tom on many levels. I trust him as my partner. I trust him as my collaborator. I trust him as an artist. And I knew he was going to make something. Respectful is the wrong word, because that suggests that there's some sort of barrier around it and there had to be a certain look, so that's not the word, but they were going to be worshipful. They were going to be, you know, in awe of me, of my body in this state, because that was very much the way we were lucky enough to experience our final pregnancy, was with this exceptional amount of joy and, you know, health and this sense of abundance and love. So I knew that would all be there in this work. And so I think once I got over the initial shock of him sort of sifting through the images of me being like, I was very excited to see Tom do something so beautiful, because if you've been following Tom's work, you'll know it's always beautiful, but it's often quite confronting and challenging. And I think the word you used earlier on is so right. These are like inviting, these are invitations. You want to step to them and enter them. You know, they're not kind of hitting you, they're like saying, come closer.
And the color palette changed as well.
So
the
beautiful.
color palette changed when you had the successful pregnancy. It changed your color palette.
Yeah,
and became more kind of expansive and colorful. And was it a shifting point? The actual kind of
there were multiple shifting points towards that. I think one is like, I think I'd got a bit fed up of people
saying what I just said.
Well, yeah, but like I'd look at my work and I would see like beneath it mourning and like an attempt to beauty and tenderness, and then other people would see like darkness and angst and anger. And if you saw the work, you'd think they were more right than me. As in, like they are often my work has been like shouting.
First impression,
yeah. And like I thought maybe what I want to do is like flip that anyway. So one in general, but two specifically for this body of work. So you make works that are invitations, and then they slowly reveal this other stuff beneath them. But then there were just some simple, like formal interests. So I would say the two main things within all of these paintings, color-wise, particularly the ones in this room, is the colors that you see in let's call it the background for simplicity. Like, were an attempt on the one hand, so if you forget the blue, but everything else was thinking, if you took the spectrum of colors from which you make flesh and you kind of refracted it or kind of sent it through a prism, so kind of opened it up, or to put more simply, like, you know, almost the range of colors that might exist on your palette before you're kind of mixing them up to construct the natural grays of flesh. What might it look like to kind of construct thinking of the canvas as like a skin across which flesh is dragged. What would it look like to paint flesh in that way, opened up rather than stitched together? And not thinking of that as like a wound or as damage, but something kind of beautiful. And then the blue, very specifically, I mean, one, there's obviously signifiers with blue of just, sky, sea, river, water, whatever. But also blue is the color, obviously, of distance and therefore of loss, but therefore of, spatial depth as well. And I was interested in constructing spaces that are through the color that feel both impossibly deep and like beyond us and kind of limitless, whilst feeling kind of completely pushed up to the surface and there. And for that twofold play to be happening at the same time, and knowing that therefore they're paintings of flesh and light, which therefore means that, not wanting darkness, or even if there is darkness, like in the ones at the front, it's kind of the darkness of like the last light of the day, like the way that last light of the day or the first light of the day might seep through a set of like netting or curtains or material, and trying to speak to that kind of darkness, which is obviously not therefore depressing, as hopefully it's about like emergence rather than whatever else darkness might signify. Yeah.
Why strange bodies?
So it's in a couple of the early, so one of the earliest full tellings of this, so Ovid writes one of the most beautiful retellings of Orpheus and Eurydice, and in a couple of the early translations of his text, the phrase "strange bodies" keeps coming back up, and it's where he's actually talking about all the kind of, in the entire book, all the stories he's going to tell. He's talking about figures who are going to morph and metamorphosize and shift and change. So, humans to gods, from humans to animals to different forms of the natural world. And so he talks about strange bodies of one form mutating into another. So something like bodies new and strange. He keeps repeating that phrase. And so it felt like nice to lift this quote from Ovid, who's like a central source of the work. But then, it then sits there as this like thing that feels true to the work. So again, like not a thing you need to be aware of that connective tissue. Mm-hmm. But yeah, and I think I like 2-word titles as well. Yeah.
I think anything else you want to say? I think I'm covered pretty much. Is there anything else you would like to share with us?
Well, anything you?
I'll have a think if you've got something.
These things are always interesting, like people out there in the world, and then seeing and even just putting work on in a space is interesting. And we discussed this when we were having our first conversation about which works to put in a show, and like this body of work obviously is particularly personal, so then you do feel a bit more raw about how it might come into the world. And we were discussing how like the root of the word curation means to care. And there's something I've felt through this process with,
and pieces to create.
Yeah, exactly. So then like, which was your kind of brilliant idea of calling the show that. So like the idea of like the show meaning to create, meaning to come into being. And I like the idea that curation means to care, because I think once the work leaves the studio, you then have, you have a curator working with you, you have a gallerist working with you, you have visitors coming to it who are then all become collaborators in the work. Like I see a viewer as a collaborator in the work, like completely. And I think there's something really nice about that sense of care being like really important, like coming
tough.
to things.
I have to confess, it was really tough because it was a very personal story.
Yeah.
How you choose what to exclude or include and which criteria, and how to interpret or put it in a specific space with specific restrictions, and even the text.
Yeah.
I had to write. I said, "You do it. You're both authors. How much can I write about your story?"
Yeah.
So we really had to be collaborative. Otherwise, I felt that I was kind of violating areas, and definitely that was not my intention. So I felt that the point was the creation.
Yeah.
And all the troubles around it. I appreciated your art history background, which I think it's very significant in, which artistic directions you're doing in your practice, okay? Or your whole journey together, or your inspirations, because you were specialized in kind of.
So Titian, who's like a big
Yes.
reference point in these paintings, and then I mean, God, years ago, like 2005, that was when I was there. So that's been he's been there 20 years, which is wow, longer than you.
I know.
Anyway, for me it was a very pleasant journey, but it was also kind of interesting to see how people reflected, because you get a space where people feel more comfortable sharing their own stories. We had, very, very complicated reactions in this space. People leaving the first 10 seconds, it's too heavy for me, I have to come back another day. Because they were trying to find ways to handle it emotionally, because I think, it's not a unique story.
Mm-hmm.
I think so many women have gone, and their partners, because they know that they go through the emotional process as well, loss and again, and so I could see many people engaging, which was, exciting always, and also opening up and sharing the stories and seeing their own different things. So yes, it was very nice.
Thank you. It was gorgeous.
And I enjoyed reading the book as well, which I thought we were going to have some copies here for signing, or for someone else who wanted. Do we have any books?
We don't, but all good bookshops will.
Okay. That's for me. Do you have any questions? Yes. Sorry.
For example, you can tell me to leave the room. It's just a question I've been wondering for a long time. When I read Strange Mothers, there is this one aspect, right? When you write, I think you're in Rome, and you are describing your pain, but you're also describing her. And you're describing how you're losing her. She's going, not to say borderline gone, she's falling, fading, becoming this shadow. So I could feel the pain. And there's so many different layers of pain. And then when I see this work, there's that pain, which is finally coming to terms with the opposite, the joy. And I also have seen the joy because I've met your daughter, and that is the incarnation of joy, right? So I am mixing here the work and the life. My question is, in both of your creative practices, as professionals and as people, how do you reconcile them both? Because when I have that pain, I look back and I have a hell of a heart. I feel the resentment, I feel the pain. Maybe I'm just someone who cannot let go. Who knows? My question is how do you reconcile them both? Because I can see it.
Yeah.
But I want to know the how, if that makes sense.
You want to go first?
You go.
Okay. Well, I not turn this into a group therapy session, but one answer is therapy. And I like where your question went, because I thought you were going to ask how I felt having Tom write about that time, particularly in Rome. And I was so angry at that point in our journey. And it actually felt so cathartic to see it through his eyes and to know that I was translating my pain adequately for him to realize how bad stuff was. Because there is nothing worse than being like, no, I'm going through it and no one sees it. So to be seen, and that's how I felt throughout our relationship, actually, from that first moment of walking into your studio. Yeah, he saw me. He painted me before he spoke to me. He saw me. And that's how I've continued. Yeah, it's right through. And yeah, I just felt incredible. I've always felt very seen and held, but also free to kind of be angry and not have to mask and be a pretty version of pain. Like, it was ugly, and I saw that in his book, and I love it, and I see the joy and the beauty in these, and yeah, I feel very seen.
And I think the experience is completely different, the small ones and the big ones. Any comments on the scale, or the selection of scale, or the different form of experience with the scale?
It was quite a simple thing in some ways. It was the idea that these large ones want you to feel very bodily, so they kind of broadly equate to like the width of your arms, or I mean, I'm quite short, so they're a lot taller than me, but they're kind of roughly human scaled spaces already. And it allowed then for the figures who were within them, I wanted them, or at least the central figures, to be broadly human scaled, again, so they're like right there, present with you, versus the small ones, whether it's these or the drawings downstairs. I like the idea that those there's a kind of a different intimacy, and then they become a bit more cinematic, so often the figures will be smaller in relation to the space. So you might have a bit more architecture, a bit more sense of the world that they're inhabiting. And that's because I think it's something nice about a small work, that you can enter it in that space and then it opens up. So I wanted the kind of confrontational is the wrong word, but like the close sense of the figures versus the kind of the distances that these could play with. And then these mid-scale works, it was the idea that what if you played the same size figures, so life-size figures, but straight away they're going to be cut by the frame, so you start to get this sense of, that causes different kind of ruptures of time and space that allows you to do like very, very different things formally in the kind of the setup of what the figures might be doing and how we might respond to them.
What's next?
Oh God.
Collaboratively and...
Well, we're doing a new book for children. Are we allowed to say anything about it? Which is another really jolly one about grief and a raven. I'm not going to say any more than that, so probably
kind of niche.
kind of real world setting, but with like magical, real, surreal elements around the processing of the grief, but set very much in the real world.
What are you doing with that?
I'm doing all the artwork in that,
Illustration.
all the illustrations. So there's these kind of moments, particularly the dream sequences, where you're almost being told the story purely visually, or text and visual, and then so you have this very different rhythm with like moving through the story through text in a relatively linear fashion, and then the dream sequences become these breaks within that. And then after that, I am doing a graphic novel for Granta that is takes a Holocaust diary from the Lodge ghetto, written in the final months of the ghetto before it was liquidated, and the author was then sent to Auschwitz. And I'm kind of inhabiting his words, but his hopes, his dreams, his awareness of what was happening. And the body of paintings that I'm going to be making after that graphic novel aren't about that. They're kind of like a response away from that, like an antidote to it. And they're going to be paintings that take John Keats's Spring Odes, and then trying to play with like the lie of the individual, the lie of the artist as an individual. And they'll be about kind of painting as a space to attempt to transcend like the real world or the horrors of history, etc. So it'll almost be like all the archives that I've spent the last couple of years in around the Holocaust. It's like a space to like get away from that. So they're kind of in relation to the graphic
You
novel rather
recently
than about
visited
it.
the West Bank as well.
Yes. So I went to the diary itself is in Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. So I spent a long time wondering about the politics and the ethics of going and seeing it, and for ages I thought, well, the simple answer here is like, no, I'm not going to go to a state that is committing genocide, and to a museum that this would be hours to unpack, but to a museum that in many ways is interconnected with all of that in very big ways. And then I thought, well, I've kind of got to see the diary, and this project is about the history that needs to speak to the present moment, and without going there, I can't speak to that. So the idea was to spend a certain number of days in the archives with the diary, with the museum, with the curators, and then to go out to the West Bank, where I was helping run some writing workshops, and obviously with an awareness that you're like picking a grain of sand of what's happening, but like some sense of like situating yourself in the present moment and thinking how that relates to the historical
The
source you're thinking
the
of.
shared experience of...
Exactly.
the humane shared experience.
Yeah. So the flight I got back was the last flight before then there was the Israel-Iran stuff. So it was like literally as I landed, like all flights. So yeah, it was kind of a astonishing, disturbing trip. But
So you have these?
I have
And
this.
another publication,
Yeah.
and another exhibition in Cambridge, I think.
Sorry, that would have been the simple answer. Yeah, this body, this body of work, yeah, then goes to the Museum of Classical Archaeology in Cambridge from February to May. It's an amazing space of.
I think it's going to be a completely different interpretation and completely different selection.
Exactly, because they'll be in relation to the sculptures and into that context. And it's a nice full circle moment. It's the first institutional show I ever had in 2008 was there, and just as that show was coming to an end, was literally when we met. So like for
You
them.
studied in Cambridge, both
Yes.
of you? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in Cambridge you met?
Yes,
This-
yeah, when he was
okay.
artist in residence. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd left to lecture kind of in kind of lecture, and then had got this residency back at Christ College, where they basically gave you a studio for a year and funded you, and that's where
That's
we met.
exciting.
Yeah. That was kind of like, it felt the moment of like, okay, I can maybe try and be an artist.
And I have a love story coming out in March. It's called Almost Like
Yeah,
Me.
sorry.
by-
Love story, okay. Is Coral doing something? Not yet. I'm sure she's contributing
Forming a lot
somehow.
of opinions.
Yeah.
Lots of
She's
opinions.
4, 3.
She's about to
Three.
turn 3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
3.
Yeah.
Yeah, she has opinions.
I've noticed that
Yeah.
already. Any more questions? No? Well, thank you very much for being here, Varvara Roza, for putting this exhibition together in all of us, and you for coming here this time of year. Tom and Kieran, for putting your personal experience and your knowledge and your emotions and your whole work basically in what we see today, more or less. I'm sure there's plenty more, but thank you so much. for
Thank you so
everything.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And have a lovely